You would think during a pandemic that we could all work together, but unfortunately that's not the case. And there are many COVID-related scams happening right now, especially in the Bay Area. Unsuspecting people becoming victims of identity theft, and sometimes things that are a lot more intrusive and worse. Joining me in this episode is an FBI agent based here in Tampa with a focus on busting these scammers. He's Special Agent Andy Sekela, and this is the Rebound Tampa Bay podcast. I was really excited to talk to you. I basically ran off the set after the show and got back here because I think you can shed some light and really give us some interesting input on some of the rotten things people are doing during the pandemic, scamming people. So I've got Special Agent Andy Sekela with me, private sector coordinator with the FBI in Tampa here. We can start with some of the biggest COVID-related scams that you're watching right now.
First off, let me say that the schemes that they're using, these are not different. They didn't create any kind of new schemes. These are just variations of existing schemes. So these bad actors, as is their nature, they saw a vulnerability with all the chaos and anxiety created by the pandemic, and they capitalized on that to exploit those vulnerabilities. So in particular, when we talk about the purchase of medical devices, PPE, anything that can be used to combat the pandemic or treat patients, they saw that as a very specific opportunity for them to defraud some additional victims, and that's exactly what they've done.
Okay, first thing, Special Agent Sekela, first thing. How in the world are they able to confuse a local government agency?
Okay, first off, let me say that these are pros. This isn't some 18-year-old kid. Well, could be, I guess, but generally speaking, it's not some 18-year-old kid who this is his first rodeo. They've been doing this for years. They have playbooks, if you will. So, for example, we've seen call centers that are set up generally in other countries, some in the United States. So just like a telemarketing center, a legitimate telemarketing center in the U.S. has a script, a playbook, if you will, to conduct these types of schemes. These bad actors have that same kind of playbook, except instead of doing legitimate business, selling legitimate products or services, they're not selling anything. They're trying to rip people off. But they literally have these playbooks or manifestos that give guidance to the people who are on the calls or who are sitting behind the computers in a chat room or whatever else, that tell them what they need to say and do in order to trick that victim into thinking that whatever product or good that they're supposedly selling is real.
And apparently they're very convincing, and they play on desperation because at the beginning of the pandemic, all we could talk about were the need for masks or gloves or sanitizing wipes or, in some cases, ventilators. That was certainly something that was highly sought after, in some places still is. Am I hitting these things on the button? Is this what we're talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah. We had one complaint about a vendor that claimed they had 1 million N95 masks. Okay, so just think about that for a second. I don't know exactly how big the packaging for an N95 mask is, but if you're going to hold 1 million of anything, it's going to require a pretty large warehouse.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to fathom.
That should have been the first red flag right there. And that's one of the sales that a local government fell victim to in trying to purchase these 1 million N95 masks.
Well, of course, I'll take whatever details you are able to give me about this. I'm sure you're not going to name the local government that fell victim to it, right? We can.
Correct. It wasn't in this area.
Well, we could safely assume you're not going to talk about that. But take me inside this a little bit, and what exactly you discovered when you were put on this case and had to investigate it.
And this, it's pretty typical of these type of fraudulent claims that we get. A seller, and again, it's not unique to COVID-19. I mean, these kind of scams went on well before this. But again, this is an opportunity for specific pieces of equipment that the bad guys capitalized upon. So generally what happens in these types of fraudulent schemes is a procurement official or a purchasing agent at a company, a procurement official at the government, will receive an unsolicited text or email from a vendor claiming to have a product that's in demand. They'll engage in that typical contract debate and discussion about the sales price and other terms of the sale and whatnot. So on the surface, at least, it appears that this is a legitimate purchase because the bad actors have done their homework. Again, this is not their first rodeo. They've done this before. They know how a legitimate procurement process plays out. So they're going to talk the talk and use the lingo so that they appear to be as legitimate as possible. So in this case, the bad actors provided stock photos, what we think were stock photos of these million masks that were available for sale. And the government that was going to purchase these items, they didn't do their sufficient due diligence to verify that these items were in fact for sale. So there's really two types of schemes when we talk about the fraudulent sale of PPE. The one is for counterfeit goods. So in other words, maybe they have a million N95 masks, but they're not legitimate N95 masks from the original equipment manufacturer.
Of course.
They're counterfeit.
Right.
So in that case, at least the buyer gets something. Now it's a subpar product, but at least they've gotten something in return for their money. The other type of scam, and that's the case that happened here, was there just was no product available. This vendor was a complete fabrication. They didn't have any equipment to sell. So as I mentioned, the procurement official for this local government just simply didn't do their due diligence. And this is something that we encourage everyone to do their due diligence. Even if you're buying something personally for $50 on the internet from a shady internet site, you may want to check out that site, do your homework to make sure that you're not going to be out $50, that you're going to get what you paid for. Obviously, that due diligence becomes even more important when you're talking about an order that is for $1 million or more.
He's Special Agent Andy Sekela with the FBI, and maybe now's not a great time to admit to you, but I do know people that wanted to buy me some sports jerseys, for Christmas or my birthday or something like that. And these sites are so prevalent out there, the knockoff sports jerseys where you get what looks like a $150 jersey for $25 or $15 or what have you. And what was so funny to me, just to tell a light story in the midst of this, is that I was doing some work with the Tampa Bay Lightning, and I was talking to a couple of their people in their marketing department. They're like, oh, those jerseys, we can spot them a mile away. There's just a couple of tweaks, a couple of things to the logo that's off, because you get a jersey. Right. Most times you get the product like that, but it's not an NFL or NHL licensed product. So right. Again, I think a lot of people can relate to that form of it. Now, I know what you're going to say next. The other form of this type of scam is where you just simply don't get anything.
Yes. And that's what happened in this particular case. But as part of that due diligence, one of the options that a company or a government has before they engage in a large purchase is to have someone go and verify that quantity of goods exists and that those goods are in fact legitimate. And in this case, the seller was overseas, so it was difficult for that government to verify the existence of that product. Now, if it was me, especially if it was my company and this was a private company purchase, I would have flown over there before I'm spending millions of dollars on a product, spend a couple $1,000s for a trip, go to that vendor site, make sure that what you're getting is legitimate and exists to begin with. Another option, if it's overseas, is to have a registered agent for your company or government. Hire someone, because there's legitimate places in other countries that do this, because obviously business is conducted overseas on a routine basis.
Of course. Well, I'm dumbfounded that the government official didn't do the legwork here. Are you able to tell us how much money they lost as a result of this?
I don't know what the actual loss amount was, but again, if they thought they were purchasing 1 million masks, so the loss amount was significant.
Yeah, that definitely stings. That stings quite a bit. But as this relates to our audience here today, not that anybody out there is going to be looking or even buying any solicitation for that type of quantity of goods, but it really you've seen it. Certainly, you've seen it in the private sector with just regular citizens, right?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of fraudulent websites that were set up after the pandemic really started to hit. Websites that tried to raise money for charitable purposes, to conduct research, or for victims of COVID-19 or anything else. We see that whenever a hurricane hits or an earthquake or whatever. These fraudulent charity websites pop up. There was a lot of these vendors that were completely fraudulent, that were selling all different kinds of things. There were also companies that were like pharmaceutical companies and companies that made like non-medical, holistic medicine, and they were making all kinds of claims that were not substantiated by the FDA that this product is going to help you either treat the virus
or cure it,
or it's going to help you prevent you from getting the virus. Yeah. So again, making all these kinds of claims. I think that's probably the most numerous or common type of complaint that we got. Now those are a little harder to investigate from a criminal standpoint in terms of fraud. And that's more of like a regulatory issue. And a lot of those websites were just simply shut down by the regulators. But of course, if a website's not in the US, then it becomes more difficult for us to counteract those bad actors.
Ran several of these stories on Good Morning Tampa Bay, our news program in the morning. Several of these things that tell people to watch out for these types of products that claim that they can cure you or prevent COVID-19. What we tell our viewing audience all the time is if it looks too good to be true, it almost always is.
Absolutely.
Do you have any other is there any other better advice to give people when to be on the lookout for these types of things that'll leave them with out of money or with a subpar product or, nothing at all?
Again, it's all about due diligence. If you are purchasing from a company, do your homework on that company. They should have an established presence. A website that appears to be legitimate and functional. And if there's errors in the communications that you get, the text or email communications, if you look on their website and it just doesn't look right to you for whatever reason, if they're asking for non-traditional payment methods like gift cards or iTunes cards or something like that, if they refuse to talk to you on the phone and they only want to communicate via text or email, if they're demanding the payment up front, if they cite obscure COVID-19 related regulations that require you to pay additional monies for shipping and insurance or whatever else. I know I'm saying a lot of different things here, but the problem is there's a lot of different red flags that are out there. But the good news is that it means that as a consumer, whether you're an individual or a company or a government, there are things that we can do to try to help protect us from becoming victims of fraud.
And we definitely want to get into that. FBI Special Agent Andy Sekela joining me on the Rebound podcast. This is really great to have you here. Sir, I got to say, this is so interesting to me, and there's a lot to get into and a lot of different areas I want to touch on. But for anyone I'm speaking to right now that's been a victim of fraud and has been scammed out of money and hasn't gotten that money back, say you paid for something with a gift card or you didn't do it through a credit card company that could refund you the money. Andy, can you tell me how often our government, your agency, is able to crack down on these places? Maybe they're overseas or they're people in our country, and actually catch them in the act and apprehend people who are doing this, because so many people just lose money and we just kind of say, well, it's gone.
I wish I was a squad supervisor for the white collar crime squad here in Tampa for 7.5 years. And every day I got fraud complaints. And I only wish that I had had enough agents to go out there and investigate every claim, every complaint that we got related to fraud. But from a practical standpoint, obviously we're limited in resources like any other agency is. So we can't investigate every incident of fraud that we get. That being said, we still encourage people to report any internet or wire fraud crimes to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. And that's www.ic3.gov. Internet Crime Complaint Center. That's the clearinghouse for all complaints related to internet and wire fraud. So even if the amount that you lost doesn't meet our threshold to open an actual case, the IC3 analyzes the complaints that are received every day. And what they're trying to do is identify larger schemes, subjects that are common to multiple different fraud schemes. And if we get enough of footprint, enough of complaints related to a specific individual or company, then that may give us the justification that we need to dedicate those resources to conduct a full-blown investigation.
There's a couple more things, and that's really great information. There's a couple more things I want to touch on before I let you go here that you sent over to me, some information. You're seeing some fraud with antibody testing. I was hoping you could go into a little bit more detail with that and what you're seeing and what people can be on the lookout for there. I'm assuming you're not seeing so much with just regular COVID tests, but the antibody test, that's also something that's coveted by a large amount of people right now, particularly in the Bay Area, because We're obviously, Florida is seeing a tremendous amount of cases, so people would like to know at this point if they've already had it. Do they possibly have some kind of immunity buildup? So let's start with that.
I'll give you a pretty egregious and offensive example. We had an elderly couple that was victimized. A couple people knocked at their door, claimed they were from the CDC, and they were there to conduct antibody testing. So the elderly couple, without question, lets them into their home. So that's the first red flag right there. So fortunately, they didn't hurt the elderly victims, but obviously they could have. And then they proceeded to conduct a variety of tests on that elderly couple and obtain all of their personally identifiable information. So there was a couple of frauds that resulted from this. First off, they billed Medicare for all the tests that were done, unauthorized, unnecessary medical tests, not just the antibody test, but a number of other tests as well. Second, they stole the identities of the two elderly victims. Now, again, fortunately, that's all that happened to them, but they easily could have been robbed or wounded or hurt or even killed
exactly.
by these criminals that they had unwittingly or unknowingly let into their home. So that just gives you an example of the brazenness of these types of criminals. It's one thing to receive a phone call or an email from a fraudster, and hopefully you don't lose anything, but maybe you lose a couple $100 and that's the end of it. But can you imagine finding out that you just let two criminals into your home and gave them all of your personal information and medical information?
Oh, it's one of the most invasive things. It's worse than it's worse than getting robbed. It's worse than being away from your home and then losing possessions. It's so right. That's so uncomfortable, such a terrible feeling. That's pretty rough, but it leads me into the next thing. You're seeing a lot of fraudulent unemployment claims that are being filled with stolen identities. You mentioned this elderly couple had their identities clearly stolen here by these people that invaded their privacy and their property, but you're seeing it with unemployment claims with stolen identities as well.
Absolutely. Again, back to what I said earlier, any vulnerability that the bad actors see as an opportunity for them to enrich themselves, they'll jump on it. This is a perfect example. Wherever there's money available, you're going to find fraudsters. So as soon as these stimulus packages were announced, the fraudsters, their minds are turning, right? The gears in their head are turning. How are they going to be able to steal some of the money that's being offered to people that are truly put out because of this pandemic, people that have legitimately lost their jobs who deserve the money? That's the intent, obviously, of these stimulus packages. But there are fraudsters out there that don't care about that. They just want to find any way, take advantage of any way they can to enrich themselves.
And is there any blowback to you if your identity was stolen and used for an unemployment claim?
There could be. At the very least, you could come up as a potential subject of an investigation, at least until you're cleared. But obviously, there's a whole host of problems that can happen to someone whose identity is stolen, regardless of how that's used.
Special Agent Andy Sekela with the FBI joining me here on the Rebound podcast. Andy, you want to go through a couple of things here before we go. If you think you've been scammed, what's the best thing to do?
The best thing to do is to call your local police department. And if it's an internet or wire fraud related scam, file a complaint with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. That's www.ic3.gov. And keep in mind that you want to have all the information available when you file that report. You want to have the name of the person, even though it may be a bogus name, you still want whatever name was used. You want the phone number, if you can find the IP address. If you have an email associated with it, you want to save that email and provide it to law enforcement. Any details like that you can provide will be helpful to law enforcement.
And then let's bring it full circle. Again, you're telling people it's due diligence. It's using,
Absolutely.
And a lot of times it's really using common sense and doing a little investigative work yourself before you actually place an order or throw some money at something.
That's right. And the FBI has a number of tips on its website related to just fraud schemes in general, do's and don'ts. And there's a public service announcement that the FBI specifically put out recently related specifically to fraud associated with COVID-19.
And let me throw something out there as well. If you're listening to this and you do have some elderly relatives or some people that maybe are living alone, a little bit older, maybe it's a good idea to print these things out, pull them up on your smartphone or device, read them to those people that in your family that you love. Go over that with them. Just put it in their mind to be on the lookout. Be a little wary of these things.
That's a great point.
I thought I'd try and add something to this today. Special Agent Andy Sekela joining me here on the Rebound podcast. You can subscribe to the Rebound Tampa Bay podcast on Apple and Stitcher, and you can also watch a video version of this podcast on the ABC Action News streaming channel. Here at ABC Action News, as we continue to rebound, there are steps you can take to find help for you and your family. We've got it all laid out for you. Just go to abcactionnews.com/rebound. I'm James Tully. Thanks for listening.